Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Um, we're going to be talking today about values, not just articulating them, but also embedding them and then measuring how well you are living your values in your organization. So welcome, everyone. Um, if you have questions as I talk, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll take them at the end. I'm definitely going to leave lots of time for questions at the end. Got 25 slides or something like that to roll through. And then let's get into a conversation. So please, if you think of a question, just bang it in the chat and Charlie and other colleagues on the call can help triage that. So values, a very important topic, very dear to my heart. So what are we going to cover today? A little bit about us at Junction, why I think values really matter, what we see at the moment, and then 3 steps to set up a really values-driven workplace. First of all, articulating, then embedding, and then measuring, and then a bit of a kind of what's next and a Q&A and stuff at the end. So without further ado, I'll just run through a little bit about Junction. I think many of you probably know all of this and live this in your daily working lives. But the economy is changing and we need it to change. I'm sure you're all only too painfully aware how poorly GDP is serving us as a measure of progress. And increasingly, governments, consumers, stakeholders everywhere are looking to companies to do something about that and to really evidence that they are prioritizing being inclusive, being regenerative, and making the world a better place. And we have been supporting companies to do that for over 25 years. We've been operating, started in Canada, came to the UK about 15 years ago. I've been involved for most of that time. And we say that our mission is to help leaders build the success stories of the purpose economy. Probably most of you know, we've been a B Corp since early 2016, and we are advocates for things like the Better Business Act and put in some non-profit pro bono time to supporting legislation like Zero Hours Climate and Nature Bill, which is going for its second reading in the Commons in January. I'm delighted to see. We've been lucky enough to work for a broad range of clients, everything from multinationals to early stage social ventures, local, regional, national, global organizations, and some really inspiring brands, Doctors Without Borders, The Guardian, Body Shop, and the United Nations among them. So we say that we help future-proof organizations, and we have services in strategy, culture, and team performance, helping companies to certify as B Corps and then to report and disclose on the difference they've made against their stated purpose. So what does that look like? These are the sorts of services that we offer in those headings. Essentially, the way we see things are, and the contribution we can make is that we need companies to create a plan to make more positive impact, to build a thriving culture that will help activate and deliver on that plan. We're keen to help you if you want to join the best-in-class holistic sustainability certification B Corp to validate your work and to get you into community of like-minded peers, and then to help you reflect and report on your performance. So that's enough about that. Why do values matter? They help you make better decisions, more effective decisions, and decisions that are in line with the founder or owner's aspirations, I think is an important point here. You need to know what you stand for, and you need to be able to articulate it and share it so that your values can act as a framework through which to make decisions. I think another really important aspect of this is it energizes the workplace. If people are clear about what you stand for, what you value as a founder or as an owner or as a leadership team, it creates a glue that helps teams stick together. It creates a sense of camaraderie, of higher motivation, And I think what you get is essentially a better place for people to work, a place they enjoy working, I hope, but also a place that can be more productive and make more of a difference. And that should manifest itself in being able to delight your stakeholders, either that's your community around you, your clients, the people you work with, your suppliers, um, showing up in accordance with clearly stated, embedded and measured values, I think is a key way that you can be distinctive in the way that you engage with all those important stakeholders in your working life. And as some of you will be aware, there's a change coming to the B Corp standards. And part of that is going to be called Fair Work, within which is going to be a whole requirement to measure workplace culture and to be able to evidence that you are taking action to improve that culture. And I think that's going to be a key change to what it is to be a B Corp. Certainly, there's been a somewhat kind of hidden aspect of culture, or not explicit aspect of culture in being a B Corp. And the new standards make that explicit and set it as a requirement on B Corps to do that measurement and acting. So what do we see today? Literally, words on a wall is the most common place that, and only place that values often show up. So they've been around for a long time. Companies have talked about having values and having corporate values, and being able to embed them, but often they just remain single words on a wall or in a manual that doesn't really mean anything. Essentially, they're performative, you could argue. It's just for show. And certainly, I think your customers and your suppliers might simply not experience values that you have unless you intentionally do something about articulating, embedding, and measuring your performance against them. And of course, if you don't do that, your employees are going to find it impossible, frankly, to integrate those values into their roles. So what you'll see is that you might have these words, but your culture cannot possibly align to that without this intentionality. And it will suffer your culture, and values won't be driving decisions. They won't be energizing the workforce. They won't be delighting stakeholders. So it's really important to be explicit, to embed, and to measure. And those are really the three steps to setting up a values-driven workplace. You need to articulate them and the principles that sit behind them, so employees know what's expected, how to live those values, and other people that you engage with in your work can start to sort of feel them and experience them for themselves. But it's also just not good enough to, I don't know, put a bit of narrative around the single words. You actually need to do something about embedding them in the way you work, and ensure that your strategy aligns with those values, that you're doing things coherently and consistently. And then you need to set up the system that I've been talking about already, trailed a couple of times, this idea of measuring and course correcting. If you don't have a system to track how well you're living your values, you won't know how well they're being lived. Other values may appear, or you may just sort of drift. So you need to do that measurement, and you need to do course correcting as a result of what you find doing that measuring and that assessing of how well you are or not living your values. So let's dive a little bit deeper into articulating your values. I guess first of all, it's important perhaps to be clear about what I'm talking about here. There are different types of values. I'm not really talking about permission to play values here. Those are those kind of minimal behavioral expectations of employees. You know, those kind of words you often see, like integrity or honesty, respect. I don't think those are really core values. Frankly, I mean, they're just what you should expect anyone to do in any walk of life. And I love to apply the opposite test here. So if the opposite is stupid on its face, then there's no merit in these words. So would a successful organization act out of integrity? Would a successful organization act dishonestly? Would it act disrespectfully? I mean, of course it wouldn't. It wouldn't be successful if it did those things. So the words themselves aren't of much value. As I say, they're just societal expectations that we should see as baseline norms and nothing more. But you could think of them, if you want to go there, as kind of permission to play values, as expectations of every employee in the business. What I'm really talking about here are core values, which are the deeply ingrained principles that guide all of a company's actions. They serve as those kind of cornerstones of your culture. And you probably only want three, maybe four values. You want it to be, memorable. You don't need 8 or 9. And they should be driving a company's decisions and behavior and culture. Um, you need to be careful about how you name them. They should provide a decision lens for strategy, but also for everything you do, for the way you design your products or services, for the way that you make decisions, for the way you deliver what you do, for the way you manage your people, and so on. And that's what we're really focusing on here, is those core values. There are also accidental values, which are essentially those that occur in the absence of core values, or at least in situations where core values haven't been embedded very meaningfully. So the management guru and author Pat Lencioni talks about these, and he tells a good story about a fashion startup brand that ended up prioritizing hires who were kind of young and trendy and hip, which kind of seemed like the right thing to do, but it wasn't actually aligned quite to their core values that they'd expressed of being trustworthy and entrepreneurial and independently minded. And this is the point. If you don't shape your culture actively, intentionally around carefully selected core values, then your culture will take on a life of its own. It will grow, as the word suggests, into the space available for it to grow. And essentially your culture will be shaped by accidental values. It will have a culture, but it won't be the one that you wanted it to have. So it's your job as a leader to intentionally shape culture and avoid the risk of accidental values being the way that you and your company show up. So where to find values? There are lists of them online. I mean, you literally can go to a list. And in fact, we've got a guide that we'll link you to at the end of the talk today, and we've included a list in the appendix. So you can find lists of words online. We use the Schwartz theory of basic values, which is a really interesting tool that we value highly. It's designed by a social psychologist, Shalom Schwartz, and he has identified that there are in these 4 buckets, which are sort of 2 pairs, like conservation is sort of opposite to openness to change, self-enhancement is sort of opposite to self-transcendence. And these 10 overarching groups of values are consistent, interestingly, across cultures, across hierarchies, over time. And it's not that one is good and one is bad. It's more that, not inherently, and it's not like some people have all of one and none of the other. We're all on a kind of continuum here. But we find it a really useful way. We use a survey tool linked to these values, a really useful way to get under the skin of an organization, or perhaps its leadership team or the founders, and really work out what they stand for and help them kind of unearth their own values if just referring to a list of words isn't doing it. But the key thing when you're picking values is you've got to think about connecting strategy and culture. So what are the cultural imperatives you need in order to achieve the ambitions of your strategy? We definitely think you should be including your people in this. Culture is a team sport. You might, for example, want to bring in longer serving employees and ask them what they think the company's values are. And as I've already suggested, the rule of 3 is really valuable here. you don't want lists and lists that people can't remember. We ended up adding a fourth ourselves. We kind of broke on our own rule. But you need it to be memorable. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So values to stories to principles. This is the kind of nub of something I really wanted to get across today. Breaking values into principles helps people from across the organization really understand what is required and what it looks like to live a value. So principles are essentially guides to behavior. We don't think of them as rules. If you like, the difference between a principle and a rule, as I've written here, is the rule would be add a half a teaspoon of salt, but the principle is seasoned to taste. So, we're not being too prescriptive here, but we are guiding. And the best way to unearth these stories is also fun. Telling stories is how humans make sense of the world around them. And if you've been in existence for a while, or you've got some longer serving employees in the business, and you've got a value, an idea, a word, and you're kind of going, what are the principles that underpin that word? A really good way into that can just simply be asking the question, tell me about a time when that value of whatever was lived in the business. And you can get in a conversation, you can do it that way. Or you might just do it by going back into the founders' early lives, or why they have those values, or what they think is important about those values. Essentially, storytelling is the way in. And then once you've got the story, you can start to discern what the what the principles are behind those values. So they might be, for example, that that there's a sort of a principle that speaks to serves as a guide. So in fact, guide is an acronym that the evaluator Michael Quinn-Patton uses to talk about principles. He says they should be guiding, so like a do this framing. They should be useful. They've got to be able to inform choices, actionable, interpretable, feasible. They've got to be inspiring. So they sort of both say what matters and what the result you're looking for is. So, they've got to be meaningful, inspiring. They've got to be developmental, by which he means they've got to kind of be applicable in diverse contexts over time. And importantly, they've got to be evaluable. So they should allow people to ensure the principles are being followed. And this is the key. If you get to an invaluable principle, then you can start to measure something. I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'll come back here and move on to an example of this. So we have a value at junction of generosity. We had a client who mentioned they were essentially kind of feeling gloomy at the state of the world and sort of struggling with all the bad news stories that were inevitably, in their feed on LinkedIn or wherever. And we just bought them a subscription to Positive News Magazine, which doesn't cost a lot of money, and cheered them up and felt they were being, listened to. So out of that, you could distill the principle that we go the extra mile. Right? It's not difficult, it's not complicated, but through the story, you can unearth the principle. Or one more recently, we were working with a food business, a restaurant chain in the States, producing their impact report, their sustainability report. And we noticed that their strategy was pants, like really poor. They're, a relatively immature reporter, and it's often, those of us involved in reporting will have come across this plenty of times. The strategy was pretty weak, and we hadn't worked with them before. We didn't know them that well. We were just getting to know them. And we, plucked up our courage and told them what we thought of their strategy. Like, it was so poor, we didn't even want to write through that section of the report. And they said, they met us where we were, if you like. And they said, well, tell me more about that. We wrote a 3-page briefing. And interestingly, they said, you know what? We're going to pause the project on reporting. I want you to do some of that strategy work for the next 2 months. And then let's come back to the rapport once we've got a stronger strategy to speak to. So interestingly, we got a extension on the project. We got a, frankly, a bunch more money to work on and do some more interesting work, all because we lived our value of courage. And from that story, you could distill the principle, stand up for our beliefs. Feel free to come off mute and share a story if you wish. I'm just going to pause for a minute. If anyone's got a value that they have in in their business and a story that they think illustrates it. Anyone bold enough to do that? Come on.
I'll share one.
Go, Sophie.
Well, it's the old, I suppose for a consultancy, the ultimate test is when you understand that there's actually it's a bad example because we ended up not being able to help this client any further, but we were working with a client to help them on their strategy. They were actually quite a mature business, global business in the beauty sector. And we'd worked with them for about a year on our taking them through our usual kind of series of competitive landscape and looking at materiality and helping them build a strategic framework. And we had been frustrated in not, it was a founder-led business, still privately owned, and had not been able to access the CEO and founder throughout this whole period. And we built up to the time at which we were having our purpose workshop to help them to understand kind of where we'd got to and what the kind of and co-create, I suppose, that sort of strategic purpose and articulation. And that we finally got the founder. She ended up calling in from the car on her way to the airport and was you know, on her phone at the time, and made it very difficult to have the workshop. And even though we had another 9 months of work lined up from that, we ended up parting ways because we just could understand that without that senior buy-in, it wasn't going to be possible to get that kind of to deliver them a strategy and a purpose. So it was quite a difficult thing to do, but yeah, tried to just walk away from something because even though we could have delivered them a strategy, it wouldn't have been theirs. It would have been ours that we kind of passed on, which wouldn't have been authentic or lived.
And that's pretty courageous. I mean, that seems like an example of being courageous, sort of saying no when you need to say
Yeah, it
no.
was scary, and as well, because it's obviously an industry thing that people talk to people, and we didn't do it in, we did it in the best spirit we could,
Sure.
to sort of, but yeah, so similar sort of thing.
Great. Lovely. Thanks. There'll be time for more story sharing at the end. So just to go through the second of our 3 steps, and about 10 more slides, we'll get into a chat, or 6 or 8 more slides. It's about operationalizing them, putting them into practice, embedding them across your business and building them into your strategy. So what we do is we create a deck. It's about 30 odd slides. It's what we call our culture and brand guide. And the first 6 or 8 pages are all about our values and our guiding principles. And we've also got our sort of position and philosophy and how we deliver projects in there, and how sort of norms for having meetings and so on, and the brand stuff. And for each value, there's a definition, and there's sort of 3 to 5 principles. So a little bit like where Sophie was just going, we, as well as sort of stand up for what we believe in on courage, we have speak the truth to power, be proactive. So, don't, if you've got something to say about a project, the way it's going, step in. Ask for help. So we articulate that as a principle of courage, because it can be, fearful to say, I'm not sure I can do this, or I need some help doing this. So we encourage people to speak, to lean into that and ask for help. And like Sophie's example, be willing to say no. We think those are the 5 principles of what it means to live our value of courage at Junction. And each of those has got a little piece about them in our culture and brand guide. And then when someone joins the business, so Aurelia, who's on the call, is our most recent joiner. We take new joiners through that culture and brand guide as part of onboarding. We think that's important. And we kind of encourage them to sort of, live in that document for a little bit. We talk them through it, but also, they've got access to it and can refer to it. And also, I think it's important to celebrate the values being lived. So we do a thing we have a weekly team meeting on a sort of repeating cycle. The 4th one of the month, I think, is there's a segment in it which we call wins and brags. And you're not allowed to speak to your own win, you're not allowed to brag about yourself, but you draw out other people's examples of doing something really well over the last month, and you share it on their behalf in front of them, sometimes to their embarrassment, but in front of them for everyone to learn and appreciate. And often really what we're doing there is celebrating the values being lived in practice. And I think, again, that's just a great way to keep sort of that store of stories refreshed, alive, vibrant, and to make it clear that the values are being kind of nurtured and cherished and lived. And for example, one thing else you could do, you could also start rewarding people against the values that you're seeking. So you could assess people in their annual appraisal against their values. You could make it part of their bonus scheme to see those values being lived. Lots of ways that you can take that culture, embed it in your governance, and really make it come alive. And then there's measuring and course correcting. So companies really rarely measure how well they're living their values. And, you can't improve unless you know how well you're doing. So a really useful consequence of articulating principles is that if they're done right, according to that guide acronym, that they are evaluable. So they are much easier to measure than values alone. And that means what you can then do is you can set up organizational surveys with a 5-point Likert scale around frequency, never, occasionally, sometimes, usually, always. And you can ask questions like, how well lived are these values by leaders, or this principle within these values? And so you list out the principles within the value of courage, being willing to say no, asking for help, etc. And you can ask both how well are the leaders living these values and how well is the company as a whole living these values day to day. And you could also then, depending on the size and structure of your organization, you could do that by you could disaggregate the data by tenure, by department, by gender, by ethnicity, by location, and draw out some key learnings from that. And those of you who are B Corp wonks, and I know there's some of you on the call, will hear in that some of the hints that the new standards are looking for in terms of disaggregating engagement satisfaction data. So you can make it part of that process. But key to this is, of course, you might discover that, I don't know, all the men think they're being terribly courageous and all the women think they're not. Or, so it's interesting to ask people for some demographic information. You can absolutely anonymize it, but for some demographic information so that you might find some interesting results in the survey findings. And that allows you to identify weaknesses and create an action plan, a corrective action plan to course correct. So what does that look like? So we do this survey every year. We're proud of our value of courage, but we also found that through the survey that generally we sort of scored a little lower than we hoped on how consistently we were living that value of standing up for our beliefs. So what we did was I said, we've got to work harder on this. We've got to make it more embedded in the way we operate. So now, and we have a lot of we're sort of project management nerds. We love having templates and documents we can use for projects again and again to kick off a project and use it in different phases of the project. So we have an internal kickoff template, and I added to that. So this is for the Junction team at the beginning of a project before speaking to the client to kick off. We've now added to that internal template a question: what is the audacious question to ask of this client on this project? And as the project sponsor, often on projects certainly out of the UK office, that then gives the team who are working on it an opportunity to reflect on, maybe some uncertainties about the client or some risks or some assumptions that are going into the project, and how we might, really live that value through the project and get more out of the project, to my kind of restaurant chain story from before about courage. So as the project sponsor, I now know what the audacious question is because we've agreed in the internal kickoff meeting, and I then sort of choose the moment to introduce that question into the project, perhaps at an interim kickoff. Maybe it's the first kickoff meeting, maybe it's an interim meeting with the project sponsor on the client side. But by doing that intentionally, by building that in, by course correcting based on the survey results, we are now better at standing up for our beliefs in our client projects, better at living our value of courage. So I'm going to stop in a minute. We've talked a little bit about why values matter, talked a little bit about what you see at the moment, words on a wall, and then the 3 key steps to setting up and embedding over time. First of all, articulating the values and really what you mean by them through the stories and the principles, then embedding it in operational guides and behaviors, and incentivizing those behaviors, and then using surveying frequency questions on a 5-point Likert scale about those principles, which need to be valuable, that underpin those values, so that you can course correct and improve, intentionally enhance workplace culture over time. And some of us were at an event last week where this quote came up. I really love it. We're going to a different place. Let's go differently, from the filmmaker and educator Nora Bateson. And this is really important to me. I want to run a business that makes a difference. I want to run a business that's about much more than making money. It's got to be about, profit as the fuel, not the destination. It's about running a business that, as we say, accelerates the shift to the purpose economy. But linked to that, I want to run a business in a way that I think businesses should be run. I want Junction to be a model of the type of business that I think we need to see more of in the world. And that requires our values to be articulated, to be embedded, to be measured, and to be enhanced where needed. So our values of fun, curiosity, generosity, courage are important to me as an owner of the business, and they set out a way of behaving that is about how I think life should be lived and how I think businesses should be run. And that's why I always say it's a huge, huge privilege to run a business and to create right livelihood opportunities for people, because I get to instill something that I think really matters into the work that I do, and crucially, how we do it. So what next? We've got a guide. Charlie can put it in the chat for you, so you can download it and read it. We hope this has given you a little bit of a steer about how you can use values to clarify decision making, engage stakeholders internally and externally more meaningfully, and, as I've suggested, help you with the incoming B Corp requirements for that part of the new standards, the Fair Work part of the new standards.